It started as my quiet slice of paradise, a private lake I'd cared for my whole life. Then, without warning, the HOA president decided my sanctuary was her playground. Overnight, she staked her claim, pouring millions into a towering $5 million cabin that loomed over the water like a dare. She even built a massive dock that stretched into what was rightfully mine, as if my property line didn't exist. I felt the weight of every arrogant board meeting in those planks. But when her greed crossed the final line, I chose a form of justice she never saw coming. What would you do when someone turns your peaceful haven into their personal empire? Before everything spiraled into chaos, life on the lake felt like a quiet promise I'd worked my whole life to keep. My property sat tucked at the far edge of a pine-lined shoreline, a place where mornings began with glassy reflections of the sky, and evenings ended in the soft chorus of crickets and the hush of water against the dock. I'd saved for years to buy this land. Every plank of my small wooden cabin and every inch of shoreline carried my sweat and sacrifice. The community around the lake wasn't large. A scattering of cabins dotted the water's edge, some passed down through families for generations. Neighbors waved as they paddled by in canoes, and weekend bonfires brought a sense of quiet kinship. We weren't best friends, but there was an unspoken code. Respect the water, respect each other's space, and keep the lake a place of peace. That was before the HOA began tightening its grip. At first, their rules felt like simple guidelines. Keep your lawn tidy, limit noise after dark. Most of us complied without much thought, but over time the tone shifted. Notices began arriving with sharper language. Small, harmless things, like a canoe left tied to a tree or a deck light left on overnight, suddenly drew warnings. It was as if someone wanted control for control's sake. I kept my head down. After all, I wasn't looking for a fight. But even from my quiet corner, I could feel the change. A prickle of unease beneath the surface of our friendly lake life. Meetings stretched late into the night. New improvements to the community were whispered about, none of which we'd asked for. And somewhere behind those decisions, a single voice seemed to grow louder, more determined. I didn't know it yet, but that voice was already planning something far bolder than any late-night rule change. Something that would shatter the fragile peace of the lake and turn my sanctuary into the center of a storm. It started with a letter. One of those thin, crisp envelopes the HOA favored, stamped with their tidy logo like a badge of authority. Inside, a single page warned that my dock light was excessively bright and disrupted the natural ambiance of the lake. I read it twice, stunned. My single bulb barely lit the end of the dock. Neighbors had brighter lights strung along their patios, but somehow my little beacon was the problem. I dimmed the bulb anyway, thinking it would keep the peace. But the next envelope came within a week. This time they claimed my canoe, tied neatly to a cedar post, violated aesthetic standards. Apparently, all watercraft needed to be stored out of view unless actively in use. I'd lived there for years. No one had ever enforced such a rule. I tried to brush it off, but the letters kept arriving, each one a little sharper, each one carrying a thinly veiled threat of fines. It felt personal, though I couldn't yet see the full picture. Meetings were suddenly called without notice. Improvements were announced, like new restrictions on shoreline maintenance and mandatory permits for even the smallest repairs. And at every gathering, one voice cut through the chatter like a blade: the HOA president. She was new to the position but quick to wield her power, an ambitious woman with the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. Neighbors whispered that she'd moved to the lake for its investment potential, but no one dared challenge her directly. Rules bent in her favor. Suggestions she made became policy before anyone had time to question them. Then came the fines. First, $50 for the unauthorized canoe storage, then $100 for a non-compliant exterior light. When I called to dispute them, I was placed on hold until the line disconnected. Emails went unanswered. It was as if the board had walled itself off, a fortress of bureaucracy designed to grind me down. By late spring, the harassment turned physical in its presence. HOA inspectors, people I barely recognized, began walking the perimeter of my property, clipboards in hand, scribbling notes as if my quiet slice of lakefront was a crime scene. One afternoon I caught a stranger photographing my dock from a passing pontoon boat. When I waved, they turned their face away and sped off. Something darker was at work. Rumors began to circulate. A neighbor mentioned seeing architectural plans tucked under the president's arm. Something about a private retreat and lakefront expansion. Another swore they'd overheard her boasting at a local cafe about transforming the lake into a premium destination. I didn't want to believe it, but the puzzle pieces began to fit together. The sudden tightening of rules, the relentless pressure to make my property conform, the way every new mandate chipped away at my control of the shoreline. And then the real blow landed. A certified letter arrived in early summer, this one thicker, heavier, carrying the cold weight of legal intent. It claimed a reassessment of property boundaries, asserting that the HOA had discovered an easement discrepancy dating back decades. According to their hired surveyor, a section of my waterfront, my dock, my favorite fishing spot, now fell under community jurisdiction. They were exercising their right to manage the space for collective benefit. I felt the blood drain from my face. They were trying to take my lake. I spent nights poring over old deeds and county records. The original surveys were clear. My property line reached 5 feet beyond the dock. Nothing had changed except the board's ambition. But proving that meant lawyers, fees, and time the HOA knew most residents didn't have. Neighbors began receiving their own letters, though none as aggressive as mine. Some shrugged and complied, unwilling to invite trouble. Others avoided me entirely, as if my fight might infect them. The president, meanwhile, moved like a shadow, her polite greetings at community events concealing a quiet triumph I could almost feel. And then, without warning, the construction began. One morning I woke to the thrum of heavy equipment. From my deck I saw a barge anchored on the far side of the lake, stacked with lumber and steel. Over the next week, workers drove piles into the water and laid the skeleton of a massive dock, one that jutted boldly into the open lake, dwarfing every other structure. At first I thought it was another residence project, but when I asked around, every neighbor shook their head. No one had applied for a permit. No one except the HOA president. Word spread quickly. She was building a private cabin, $5 million, of sleek glass and timber, right on the very stretch of shoreline she claimed in her boundary reassessment. The audacity of it stunned even the most passive residents. But by the time we realized what was happening, the framework of the mansion-sized cabin was already rising above the pines like a monument to her ambition. I filed complaints with the county, only to be told the permits were under review, a bureaucratic stall that bought her exactly the time she needed. Each call I made, each email I sent, felt like shouting into a void. The lake I had once called my sanctuary now echoed with the clatter of hammers and the hum of generators. She wasn't just building a cabin, she was planting a flag. As the walls climbed higher, her new dock crept closer to mine, until it almost touched the edge of my property. My once pristine view was now framed by the looming shadow of her construction. I'd lost count of the violations she herself had broken. Setback rules, noise ordinances, unapproved structures. Yet the board remained silent. The same people who fined me for a dim porch light refused to see the fortress rising in plain sight. And still, the letters kept coming. More fines, more warnings. Now they claimed my shoreline vegetation was overgrown, despite their own rules forbidding its removal. The message was clear: surrender or be buried under paper and debt. Each evening, as the sun bled red across the water, I felt a slow burn of rage settle deeper into my chest. This wasn't just about property lines anymore. It was about power, arrogance, and the quiet theft of a life I had built plank by plank. I knew the legal fight would take months, maybe years, and by then, her cabin would stand like a permanent scar on the lake. She was counting on that, on my exhaustion, on my silence. But she miscalculated one thing. I wasn't done fighting, because in the dark hours before dawn, as her half-finished dock floated like an arrogant challenge in the moonlight, I began to imagine a different kind of justice, one she would never see coming. The night the lake turned on its queen began like any other late summer evening. Still and heavy, the air warm enough to cling to your skin. The president's half-finished mansion crouched on the opposite bank, its sharp angles catching the last smear of sunset like a blade. Even in the dim, the polished frame of her oversized dock gleamed. A silver challenge stretched arrogantly into waters she swore now belonged to her. For weeks I'd wrestled with lawyers and county clerks, each conversation a dead end. The HOA's boundary reassessment held just enough legal gray to stall any decisive ruling. The president, shielded by the slow churn of bureaucracy, built higher and louder. By now, the skeletal outline of her $5 million retreat towered over the tree line, a monument to unchecked ego. But in her hunger to claim the lake, she'd overlooked its greatest truth. Water is patient, until it isn't. That night the moon rose bloated and full, painting the lake in a cold silver light. I slipped from my cabin like a shadow, every board of my old dock memorized beneath my feet. Months of frustration had distilled into a single, sharp purpose. I wasn't coming with noise or fire or a scene. I was coming with the quiet force of the lake itself. I'd spent days studying the construction of her grand dock. The prefab floats chained to pilings, the temporary braces left lazily unsecured at the end of each workday. It was built fast and wide, a rush job meant to impress before the paperwork could catch up. She trusted her authority. I trusted physics. As the clock nudged past midnight, I eased my small skiff into the water. The oarlocks barely whispered as I rowed toward the dark shape of her project. The unfinished dock loomed larger with each pull, a crooked crown above the moonlit water. Up close, it smelled of fresh pine and the tang of wet metal, raw ambition still curing in the night air. My hands found the mooring chains, heavy with lake slime. Weeks of planning came down to these quiet motions. The slow twist of a wrench, the careful lift of a shackle pin, the muffled clink of steel swallowed by the lake's hush. One by one, the chains fell slack. The dock, no longer tethered to its pilings, gave a low groan, like an animal waking from a long sleep. I paused, heart hammering. Across the water, my own cabin was a dark silhouette, every window black. No light stirred on her side either. Only the frogs and the occasional splash of a fish marked the silence. With the last pin freed, I pushed lightly against the dock's frame. At first, nothing. Then a slow, almost imperceptible shift, a creak, a sigh, and the massive structure began to drift. The lake accepted it with the easy inevitability of a tide. I watched as the great, gleaming platform slid away from shore. Moonlight glinted on its wet planks as it turned, caught by a gentle current that nudged it toward the center of the lake. Without the anchoring chains, the night breeze would do the rest. By dawn, it would be halfway to open water. Adrenaline surged through me, sharp and electric. I should have felt fear. Instead, I felt something cleaner. Release. For months, she had buried me under fines, rewrote history with a single surveyor's line, and turned neighbors into cautious bystanders. Tonight, the lake, my lake, answered back. Halfway back to my own dock, a distant sound cracked the night. A door. I froze, oars suspended. A rectangle of yellow light cut across the far shore, her mansion's temporary worksite trailer. A figure stepped out, small against the vast dark, phone pressed to an ear. For a breath, I thought I'd been seen. But her attention faced the drifting dock, now a silent ghost sliding into the moonlit expanse. I heard the faint echo of her voice, sharp and rising. Even across the water, the panic was unmistakable. I rowed harder, each stroke a quiet victory. Behind me came the clatter of hurried footsteps on gravel, the hollow slam of a door. Another light flared, then another. Soon the far shore glowed like a small emergency. Construction workers, or maybe the president herself, scrambling at the water's edge, their flashlights cutting frantic paths across the silver surface. They shouted, but the lake offered no mercy. The dock had already drifted beyond reach, a slow, unstoppable exile heading toward the widest stretch of open water. I reached my cabin and slipped inside, the night swallowing me whole. From my back window, I watched the scene unfold. Headlamps bobbed like fireflies as they launched a speedboat, its engine whining in protest. They circled the runaway dock, ropes trailing, voices sharp with frustration. But each attempt to hook the massive frame only spun it further, the current carrying it like a toy. Finally, the boat's engine cut. For a long, breathless moment, there was only the sound of the wind across the lake and the quiet lap of water against my dock. Then, a single voice carried faintly across the distance, a furious cry swallowed by the night. The HOA president, for once, was powerless. By sunrise, word had traveled around the lake like wildfire. Neighbors emerged onto their decks, coffee cups in hand. Faces turned toward the horizon where the massive dock now bobbed like an abandoned barge. The story spread in whispers, how the president's pride had literally set sail overnight, how her grand plan to dominate the shoreline was now adrift in plain view of every homeowner she'd tried to control. County officials arrived by mid-morning, summoned by her frantic calls. But jurisdiction on open water is murky, and their measured tones offered no immediate salvation. They would need to review the matter. Permits would need verification. The dock, her crown jewel, remained a rogue, unmoved by titles or threats. I said nothing. No one asked. But I caught the glances of my closest neighbors, quick, knowing looks that carried more solidarity than words. For months they'd watched her tighten the screws, too wary to intervene. Now they saw the lake itself deliver the first real consequence. That evening, the president finally appeared at the next scheduled HOA meeting, hair pulled into a tight knot, her usual confidence dimmed. She tried to frame the runaway dock as a temporary setback, but the room hummed with barely hidden amusement. Questions about her overreach came like sudden rain, sharp, relentless. For the first time, she stumbled. When she attempted to shift blame toward vandals, the room went still. Someone cleared their throat. Another muttered, "Maybe the lake just had enough." Laughter rippled like a wave. Her face flushed crimson, her composure cracking. In that instant, the power she had so carefully built dissolved, not with a dramatic vote or a legal decree, but with a single, unforgettable humiliation played out before the very people she sought to control. I sat in the back, silent. No victory speech, no gloating, just the quiet satisfaction of watching arrogance finally meet its match. The lake had spoken, and though she didn't know it, this was only the beginning of the reckoning still to come. Her dock might eventually be recovered. Her lawyers might draft letters, but nothing could erase the image burned into every neighbor's mind, the night the water carried away her power. And that image would shape everything that followed. The morning after the Great Drift, the lake looked different. Not because of anything you could measure, but because of the hush that settled over it. It wasn't the silence of a normal dawn. It was the kind that follows a thunderclap when everyone waits to see what remains. Mist curled across the surface, as if the water itself wanted to keep its secret a little longer. By the time the sun broke fully through the pines, the president's runaway dock had become the community's newest landmark. People rowed out in small canoes and kayaks just to gawk at the sight. An enormous, half-finished platform bobbing in the open water. As if the lake had grown tired of her arrogance and cast it off like a splinter, phones came out. Photos snapped. Someone posted a grainy shot on the neighborhood message board with a single caption. "Looks like the lake decided to fight back." Within hours, the image spread across every resident's feed. The story, at least the version told by the lake, was no longer hers to control. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down now traded sly jokes over coffee. I heard murmurs from porches and piers. The once untouchable president had finally been humbled. But behind the humor, there was something more powerful stirring. Solidarity. For months, the HOA board had operated like a private kingdom. Rules appeared without warning. Fines landed like surprise storms, and everyone quietly adjusted to avoid becoming the next target. Now that fear cracked. If her own grand project could be swept aside in a single night, maybe their small battles weren't so hopeless after all. At the next scheduled HOA meeting, the change was unmistakable. The room, usually half empty and heavy with uneasy silence, overflowed. Neighbors who rarely attended filled the folding chairs, lining the walls, arms crossed not in submission but in quiet defiance. The president entered late, jaw tight, her usual clipped confidence softened by the weight of 100 expectant eyes. She began with a statement about unfortunate vandalism, her voice pitched to reclaim control, but the words landed flat. Questions came like an unexpected tide. Why were boundary lines suddenly reassessed? Why were long-standing easements threatened? Who authorized the rapid construction without a community vote? Each inquiry cut through her rehearsed explanations. Her answers, once smooth and unassailable, now faltered. She blamed contractors, surveyors, miscommunication, but the crowd wasn't buying it. Then a quiet, elderly neighbor, someone who had endured every fine without complaint, rose from the back row and said simply, "You made us all feel like strangers on our own lake." The room went still. It was not anger that broke her authority that night, but the steady collective recognition that her power existed only as long as they granted it. A motion for an emergency vote was raised, seconded, and carried almost before she could respond. By the end of the hour, she was no longer president. The speed of her fall startled even those who had longed for it. Power, so carefully built, dissolved in a single evening of shared resolve. County officials arrived days later to investigate the floating dock. Without a legitimate claim to my property, and now without the backing of an HOA presidency, the president's permits came under sudden scrutiny. What had once been waved through as under review was now re-examined line by line. Inspectors discovered a tangle of overlooked violations, construction setbacks ignored, unapproved materials used, and shoreline protections breached. The county issued a formal stop work order. The grand cabin, still a skeleton of steel and timber, froze mid-rise. A monument to ambition halted mid-breath. As weeks passed, the half-built mansion became less a project and more a warning. Rains streaked the unfinished wood, and the once gleaming framework weathered to a dull gray. The giant dock, eventually towed back from open water by a hired crew, sat roped and empty, an orphan of its own making. Neighbors who once feared retribution now gathered freely on their porches, swapping stories of fines and letters and late-night inspections. What had been whispered in private became a public reckoning. One by one, residents began challenging old violations, demanding records, questioning policies. Without her heavy hand, the HOA slowly reshaped itself. Meetings turned from lectures to conversations. Rules were revisited and in some cases repealed. Fines were reduced or forgiven. For the first time in years, the board resembled what it was always meant to be. Neighbors, not overlords. And me? I didn't boast about what happened. I never claimed credit, never offered a confession. I simply returned to the quiet life I had fought to protect. The lake, once a source of tension, became again the sanctuary it had always been. At dusk, I'd sit on my weathered dock, still mine, still standing, and watch the light ripple across the water, each wave carrying the calm I'd nearly lost. The president? She left quietly that winter. Word drifted that the half-finished mansion was put up for sale, as is. No buyer came quickly. The market for monuments to hubris is never strong. Occasionally, I still see her name on a stray piece of mail delivered to the wrong address. It's a faint echo now, a reminder of a season when one person's hunger for control threatened to swallow a community, and how swiftly that illusion of power can vanish. Yet the real impact wasn't in her downfall or the abandoned construction. It was in the way the lake united those who lived around it. People who had once nodded politely without knowing each other's names now shared late-evening bonfires. Children who had been kept indoors for fear of rule infractions played freely along the shoreline. What began as a solitary act of defiance became a quiet catalyst for something larger. A community reclaiming its voice. On nights when the moon hangs low and bright, the water glints with the same silver light that guided that drifting dock. And I wonder if it remembers. Perhaps the lake carries its own kind of memory. A slow, patient wisdom that waits until the moment is right to remind us who truly belongs. In the end, the lesson was simple and unmistakable. Power imposed by fear is only ever borrowed. Communities built on respect outlast those built on control. And when arrogance dares to challenge the quiet, strength of people who care deeply for their home, sometimes the water itself will rise to set things right. So when you look out over a calm lake or a quiet neighborhood street, ask yourself, who really owns the peace you take for granted? Because sometimes when pushed too far, even the stillest waters have a way of speaking.